Hello and welcome to the second video for how to paint the Warden from the Sepulchral Guard box set. In the first video I showed you how to paint the armour and the cloak, and in this video we're going to paint the rest of the model. Starting with the bones of the skeleton and the face in particular. So I'm starting with Balor Brown, and this is just going to be kind of like the rest of the model actually, but to an even greater extent this time. It's going to be applied roughly. And the reason for that is I want quite a heavily textured look to the bones on the model, because that will fit in nicely with the really grungy and old looking feel to the model. I really didn't want it to look like it was new or fresh. So he looks like he's been under the ground a little bit. And if you look with how I'm applying the paint again, I'm not even using the tip of the brush very much, and I'm just sort of scrubbing the paint on there, not worrying too much about getting a smooth finish, because that's actually the opposite of what I want. It is important when you're applying the paint that you don't apply the paint too thickly. If you look at, there's only a small amount of paint on the brush, and just trying, even though you're applying it in a rough kind of pattern, you want it to be applied kind of evenly all over, so you will still be able to see some of the primer coming through. If you look at the brush at the moment, actually you can see it's all splitting everywhere and things. I'm almost dry brushing with it. There's just more paint on the brush than you would use if you were dry brushing, but you can see how that's kind of given this very patchy looking effect without having a thick layer of paint. And because if you apply too much paint, that it'll just make it look really messy and kind of like it's been amateurly painted basically. So you have to still apply the paint in a controlled way, but you want to be just a little bit random with how you apply it, and let some of that primer show through just to get the patchy effect. I am on the skull applying a slight light direction, so from the top left. It just makes it a bit more interesting than having the skull evenly lit. You don't have to do a top left lighting, but the only difference is that it means that the paint has been more concentrated on the temple to the left and upper section a little bit more, and so I can also highlight the undersides of the eye sockets and the teeth and things to stand out. Here you can see I'm doing the thigh again, exactly the same process. I do want the legs to be a bit darker than the face. The face is obviously a focal point. This arm here, I have to make it a little bit brighter because it's obviously next to the already lit cloak, so to make the lighting consistent, the light would catch the arm just as much as it would the cloak. You can see here I'm painting in between the straps on the forearm guards, and at the end of the video you'll see a photo that I've taken for the finished piece, but the forearm guard, the straps will have changed into leather. I mentioned this in the previous video as well. I couldn't decide when I was painting it whether to do them as metal straps that you just have your arm through, or whether you'd have them as leather straps. It doesn't really matter too much, but I just thought it was interesting to have them as leather in the end, because it adds a little bit more variety and detail to the model. So you can see there's not actually that much bone on the model, but it will stand out because it's going to be bright, the brightest part on the model. When I come to painting the furry cloak top section around the head, that will for a start look quite bright, but then if you've seen the final photo you'll see that it's dulled down a bit, and that'll be glazed down and things. You'll see when we get to that on the video. On just a side note again, I mentioned in the previous video when applying the paint really roughly, and you saw how when I was applying it to the skull how the tip of the brush was splitting and things like that. I was actually using my mixing brush to apply the paint, because you're actually damaging the brush by I mean, all painting damages the brush to a certain extent, but it's much more abrasive on the brush. So don't use fancy brushes to do the base work, because it'll just wear them out much more quickly. So now I'm using Ushabti Bone, and it's the same process, but you have to be a little bit neater now. It's quite a strong paint, Ushabti Bone, with a reasonably high amount of opacity. So if you go too crazy with this, it will just cover all the painting that you've already done, and you want the texture work to show through. So you just got to take your time a little bit more, be more controlled. Look at how the pattern went after you first applied it. So you didn't have that much control over it, so the pattern should be a bit more random. But now, when you're applying it, you have to look at how the pattern has come through, and then enhance that pattern, and not just completely go straight over it. And again, you should be able to see that I'm only applying a very small amount of paint to the tip of the brush. You can also see now that I'm focusing a little bit on the shape of the skull. So you have these kind of curves that go in at the side near the temples, and obviously the side near the eye sockets as well. There are hard details on there that need to be picked out. All the while still blending in these rough kind of textures on top of the skull. So obviously the back of the skull curves down into shadows, and on the right of the skull it's in shadow a bit more, so it doesn't receive quite as much work. What you may find though is, because of how on the side that's more in shadow, because there's not as much work being applied to it, that the detail doesn't look quite as neat at the end. So you might find that you have to go back with some of the earlier colours and apply them neatly, but without going up to the bright colours, because then you'll destroy the shadow. The teeth are actually quite an important part on the model, so try not to get too much paint in between the teeth, because that will be very obvious on the model. It didn't matter too much in the first stage with the Balor Brown, but from this stage on, using the Ushabti Bone, you have to make much more care when painting the teeth, because really you want them to be picked out as quite clean. If you look at teeth, they're a little bit brighter than the skulls generally, particularly in this case where I've made the skull very worn. Well, not just the skull, but all of the bone work is a lot more worn and textured. So this is almost the complete opposite in style to how Games Workshop have painted the skull on their version, which is a very clean and bright look to it. It's actually very nicely done. It's very clean, very clear, and be very easy, to pick out the details of it on the tabletop. Whereas on this one, although I've painted it for gaming, it's not quite as bold as the Games Workshop version. But from a theme perspective, I just like how it's really dirty. So it's just like climbed out of the ground or whatever. For these sections of the bone on the legs and the hand that's holding the shield, don't highlight them too much. Just pick out enough so that you can define the details, especially on the arm holding the shield. If you see that goes back into the shadows. Now it does have the forearm guard as well, but you can't see that much of it, so only the edges. So really, when you saw how I painted the armour, you just need like a line for the top and bottom section just to pick it out. But with the bones and things that on the forearms that go back and towards the elbow, those are really heavily shadowed, so you don't need to do much more than the Balor Brown in there. But it does mean that you have to be a little bit neater when you apply it, Again, like I was saying with the side of the face, it's in shadow because there's not going to be much paint over the top. You don't then have additional layers to neaten it up with the highlighting. So you can see now with the brush that I'm using, it's a much newer brush, and it's in much better condition, so it's easier to apply the sharper details on the face. So the most important areas to highlight on the face are the teeth and the lower edges on the eye sockets. The rest can be picked out a bit as well, but that just makes the face the focal point of the head. There are I'm actually using a brighter colour here as well. This is Screaming Skull, I think it is. I only just got this paint the other day. Yeah, Screaming Skull. So I thought I'd give it a go on an actual skull, seeing as it's got the name and the title of the paint. And it's just basically a lighter version of Ushabti Bone, really. And if you don't have it, you just add a bit of white to it. It doesn't show up that much brighter on the wet palette, but there is a fairly significant difference. You can see as I'm applying it now, it looks much brighter, and so the skull is now standing out much more than the rest of the model. The nice thing about painting this way is it's much quicker than the Games Workshop way for doing the very clean bone effect, because with the way they've painted it, you have to make the whole section of the bone very, very smooth, so it's lots of layers, whereas this, although it has multiple layers, you don't have to be as neat or worry about getting a smooth finish. So the texture work actually, it makes it visually interesting and is so you have to be a little bit experienced to get the texture right, so it looks doesn't look messy. But once you've got that down, it's much quicker to do that than it is to do very smooth finish all over. So now I'm going straight to Ceramite White, which is as high as the highlights can possibly go on the model. So this is the final highlight that you can add. You can see there when I was applying it on the top of the skull, that's the top highlight point, so it's slightly to the left on the top of the skull. But also I'm picking out again the important parts, the lower section of the eye sockets, which I guess would be the cheeks, and also the teeth. This is where you have to be much more neat than before as well. So what happens is, as I said, you don't have to be too neat when you apply the Balor brown, and a little bit of paint getting in between the teeth when you apply that, it doesn't matter, because when you apply the white, it's still a big tonal jump between that and the Balor brown. So once you add it, you've still got shadow in between, and it kind of neatens itself up by applying it. But if you get the white wrong, it completely destroys the teeth. So just spend as much time and care as you can in getting the teeth right. You can see here on the hand, I'm just picking out the hand itself and not going into the arm, going into the shadows as well, and it works quite nicely. You should be able to see on the photos, the photograph at the end. It kind of works to show the light catching that area where it's visible, and then obviously going into shadow. So it helps. It just helps with the whole atmosphere of the piece. Again, on this hand as well, I'm not highlighting the whole area, just picking out just quick sections to make them stand out. So now I'm painting the inside of the shield, and this is just starting with Rhinox hide. It's really hard to paint the inside of the shield with the model glued together. The Sepulchral Guard box set, they're described as being snap fit or easy build, which is fine, but it doesn't give you that many options to do segmented painting on the model, and also you can get quite big gaps. Like you'll get a big gap on the cloak at the going just behind his head if you don't glue it beforehand. So I glued it together. I've seen other people paint it separately. I think Andy Wardle did a fantastic job on his version, and he painted them separately. But painting the inside of the shield once the model stuck together is very difficult. I mean, and it's also hard for me to show as well because it's really recessed in there. Just in a side point, you can see I'm also painting the leather belt at the moment as well, using I'm only doing that because I'm using the same colour, so it's still Rhinox hide, just to block it in while I'm using the colour basically. You can see that I'm covering most of the leather belt, but I'm doing a downward motion, and if you see that just near the top section, the very top edge, I didn't quite cover that just as thoroughly, so that works a little bit on the shading element, because you see there's a slight curve, inward curve on the belt itself. I'm also painting the wooden shaft on the shield Rhinox hide, again just because I happen to be using that colour, and they're all going to be covered in this video anyway. And here, so I haven't progressed on any of the brown sections yet. I think I was waiting for some of the paint to dry, so I've gone straight on to using some cold grey, just to pick out the chainmail. The chainmail is going to be a bit dirty and kind of rusty. You might have seen in previous guides and things that I've done that I use baking soda to put textures on chainmail. I've done it on the Mortarion chainmail as well, actually. I didn't think it was worthwhile on this. It's such a small area of chainmail, and if you use too much it kind of obscures the detail, whereas on something like Mortarion it's quite nice because there's a large area of chainmail, so I can put some of the rusty section on but still have loops visible, so it still has that chainmail look to it rather than just being a big pile of rust. Whereas on this it's such a small area, it's just not worth it, and just painting on the rust colours will do the job fine. So here, this is just a second colour on the chainmail, and this is Ceramite white. I'm not going to highlight every chain link, I'm just picking out the odd one or two to make the light catch them. Excuse me, but these will all be painted over with the rust colours as well, so it'll tone down all the highlights. Obviously the chain links would have rusted it and aged along with the rest of the armour that the model's wearing, so you don't really want a super bright chainmail on. And also it distracts a little bit from the bone colour, being as it's painted at the moment is quite bright. So here I'm using Mournfang brown, and I'm just kind of scrubbing it over the chainmail. If you notice, actually, when I applied the cold grey, I painted it on in a very similar way. I didn't pick out each chain link. You can if you want, and it'll be much neater, but there's not a lot of point to it. So I've in effect dry brushed it, just with a little bit more paint than you'd use for properly dry brushing. Just because it picks out the details quickly. If you see that I'm doing downward strokes again, so it's just picking out the most forward details and how the light would catch it pretty much as well. But yes, I'm using Mournfang brown, and I'll also use some Rhinox hide in the to give it that rusty look. You can see it's really toned down the highlights on there, but don't completely block out the highlights, because you still want it to catch the eye. It's not necessarily realistic again, but as a composition it makes it more interesting. So now I'm going to the belt, and I'm using XV88, and all I'm doing is vertical lines, or horizontal for this little loop that gets tucked down and goes underneath the belt going across the waist. So there's the top highlight there, which is the light catching the curve, so it's a bit thicker, whereas these vertical lines I'm painting in are basically texture lines to kind of simulate very some leather that's been bent a lot. If you were doing it super realistic, you wouldn't just have vertical lines, but because it's a small miniature and I'm exaggerating the texture a bit, so it's easily readable when you're looking at it, and also it helps it again separate itself from sections of the rest of the model. Here I'm just painting the leather on the inside of the belt buckle, and again on the other side of the belt. You can see when I apply the lines, actually some of them are a little bit thicker, some are a bit thinner. They're not perfectly spaced. You don't want it to look too even, but you still want it to cover the whole area. So they're not all perfectly in line either. Some angle to the left or right a little bit, and also they don't connect very often on the top edge. They all hit the bottom edge, but the top edge gets the highlight line, and you want a little section at the very top going along where some of the lines don't connect to the top edge highlight line, because it just enhances that shadow feel, so you're working with the contrast a bit more, and it just emphasises the fact that the belt's got that curve. I don't mean the curve of the belt going round the waist. I mean there's like a concave element to the flatness of the leather. And here I've just added a little bit of water to one of the colours that I used for the bronze armour, which was the 50-50 mix between Ratskin, Flesh and Ice Yellow. And I do this quite often, actually. If I've got quite a few paints on the palette and the tone is close enough to what I'm looking for, I'll use it rather than just mixing or getting new paint out of the palette, because actually the pale orangey colour is very close to the previous steps as a highlight colour anyway, so there's no point in mixing up a new colour when there's one that's very close to what you'd need anyway. So the highlight positions on the texture, it's just a case again of refining the positions. So mostly it's on the lower edge, just carrying the lines down. Don't paint a line on the bottom edge. Keep the line, the hard highlight line for the top edge, which shows the light catching it. So you're just picking out the. So I did some dots there as well. The dots are in line roughly with the lines going down, but they don't connect for the whole of the line. And so, as I've mentioned already, by the end of the video, when you see the photo, the straps on the arms for the forearm guards will be painted in the same leather effect as I just did on the belt there. So this is where I'm painting in the wood grain on the inside of the shield. This is incredibly hard to show you while looking at it. I'm using Mournfang brown for the first highlight, and I'm just kind of painting on the mid section of the shield. What I decided, because it was so difficult to actually get the paintbrush in there and do any paint strikes rather, was to just paint the details in the most visible area, and then try and roughly get the paint to go into the shadows, but then I glaze over the top of it so it looks neater than it actually is. If you look, you can see the details already sculpted onto the wood, but it's quite hard. It looks easier in the video than it actually is in real life. Just to pick out each line in the grain of wood. So I followed the ones that I could, and then if, say, the hand or the knee or the rim of the shield was getting in the way, because you might be able to get your brush in there, but the thing is you need to be able to paint a straight line, which you can't do with the things in the way. You can just do a very small area, and you have to change the whole angle of the brush, and you won't be able to get a nice line while you're doing that. So you can see there that the lines, they don't go down past the knee, and they don't go up to the very top either, because there's the rim of the shield that gets in the way as well. But you can see I've just about picked out some of the lines now. If you find that you've got some of the lines wrong, don't be afraid to use some of the darker colours to redefine the recesses in the grain. You can use black, because obviously it's black primer, and that will work fine. And there's also Rhinox hide to fix any of the lighter recesses in the grain there as well. But here I'm going onto the wood on the shaft of the weapon. I'm using the same colours again, but because I've got much more space now, I can actually I've got much more space, but there's only damage on the weapon. There's not actually any wood grain painted on. So if you want to add wood grain to the shaft, you have to paint it in freehand, basically. I didn't want the grain to be too bright on the spear, so I've focused the highlights on the grain, or I will do when I get there, mainly to the areas with the damage on, so that they stand out more, and it just makes it a bit more interesting. And also keeping the lower well, the bottom of the spear darker as well, so that your eye doesn't get drawn down there too much. You can see here the contrast is much higher. I missed which paint colour it was. I think it was it might be the Balor brown. It looks like that colour. But you can see the contrast is much higher between this and the previous step. On the shield, when I applied it, there's hardly any of these bright highlights. I will go back and put some on, but I was fed up with the inside of the shield at that stage. But you can see it's a big step, but I'm not taking... these aren't going to be the main highlights. So there's going to be a further stage of highlight using, I think it's the Ushabti Bone that I go for the just to pick out the top highlights on it. Oh, it looks like I was wrong when I was actually using XV88. Let's have a look. Yeah, so it was XV88 that I was using. Also, you can see there, as I'm applying the lines, they're not all perfect lines. They're a little bit wonky in places, and some of them connect into each other. That all works to enhance the look of the wood not being even, because you can see the shape of the spear. The wood on it is already kind of all wobbly and bent in places anyway. So this enhances that, and it obviously gives the impression of wood. Because in reality, if you had a wooden spear like that and it was a professionally made weapon, you wouldn't really see wood grain in it. But this is obviously again exaggerated because it's a tabletop model, so that it allows you just to see these kind of textures on them that in reality they wouldn't be that prominent. So yeah, now I'm using the Ushabti Bone, and this is you have to go over exactly the lines that you've already done, but you have to you just pick out small areas to enhance the detail. So you can see here there's a cut in the wood, and I'm just picking out the grain around that cut, so then that focuses you into that cut, but the rest of the wood, as it goes down, goes straight down to black, whereas the highlight here around the hand, the highlight is a bit longer, and it just focuses, matches the tone of the hand a bit more then. And the higher up the spear that I go, the more highlight becomes visible, because I've done the top of the spear very, very bright, as of that would catch the light more. And also because it's quite a long way away from the head, so it's not detracting too much from that. It also, you can see, because there's more lines at the top, well, I've created the highlight lines longer, so you have to highlight a bit more at the top as well. And this is where you have to be more neat, because the first lines that I put on, as I said, they weren't super neat and they're a bit wobbly and things, but this is where you have to go exactly over the top of the lines that you've done, and by going over the top but more neatly, some of the paint from the original line is still visible, which it works as a highlight and just makes it look neater as well. You can see here on this section I decided to go back and add some highlights to the grain on the upper side of this bit of damage on the wood as well, which kind of I did on the lower section as well, but it's a bit more on this part, and obviously that's in line with the highlights on the cloak as well. Right, here you can see I actually painted in the trim on the shield. I didn't record that because it was exactly the same as I painted on the armour. So, exactly the same paint colours and same techniques on it as well. But I didn't add any white to any of the verdigris, so it's just Sotek green glazes on the shadowed areas. And you can see it's a little bit more, there's a few more line marks on it as well, so it's just to separate it slightly from the armour. But alright, so here I'm painting the belt buckle. I mentioned this on the previous video. I'm painting the gold, but I'm just using Games Workshop paints for this gold. I'm trying to get a very similar effect to the previous golds that I've used, which are mainly done using Vallejo paints, and it's just to show that you don't have to use one particular brand of paint. And there's also a tip on the belt here. I'm not sure what they're called actually, but just the bit on the end of the belt has got a little metal finishing section on. So I've decided to paint these gold because it separates the metal out from the other metal on the model. Adds a little bit of interesting warmth because there's very little in the way of actual warmth on the model. Even the bronze armour with the pinks and oranges in it has glazes of green which cool them down quite a bit. Well, blue-green anyway. Whereas gold doesn't have any kind of... I can't think of the word. It doesn't kind of rust, if you like. So I can keep this at the proper colour of gold without having to apply any weathering to it. So I'm just using Mournfang brown. Focusing on the bottom right, you can see there is much brighter. Then I'm just painting the edges of the rest of it, so inside and outside edges, but mostly the outside edges. You do a little bit on the inside edge because that helps to define the shape of it, and because it's metal, it would catch the light and you get reflections and things. So you can see here I'm just doing the same thing, just going around picking out the edges a little bit, but focusing the light on the bottom section there, and that keeps the lighting consistent throughout the model as well with the light direction, while still pushing the high contrast that you need to get non-metallic metals to work. Here I'm using some Mournfang brown just to add a little bit of kind of orangey warmth to the edge of the gold, and it helps to blend in because the Mournfang brown is a big tonal jump from the black primer. So just adding the Balor brown, is a big tonal jump from the primer. So adding the Mournfang brown is kind of a tonal step in between, while adding that bit of interesting colour as well. Then I'm going to Ushabti Bone, and this is the first highlight. You have to be a bit careful with it. It's only a small area, so you can't put if you put too much highlight down, then you destroy all the yellow and it won't look like gold anymore. This is purely to show the light catching it. So a few dots here and there, a dot on the tip of the metal rod that goes through the belt, and on any hard edges and things like that, but don't cover all of the hard edges. If it was a larger area, then you could probably cover the edges more, but because it's so small, you just have to be, pick out the odd detail here and there to make that high contrast so it looks like it's shining. Now you see on the tip of the belt where I applied that Ushabti Bone, I put too much down and it took all the yellow off, so you saw how it lost that shine again. Now I've gone back, not the shine so much as the gold look to it, so it didn't look gold anymore. So I've gone back with the Balor brown and I just painted a little bit either side of it, and that helps to blend it in again as well. Here I'm using Ceramite white. This is the final highlight, and and you're just using a very, very small amount just on the biggest highlight points. You can see on the curve where I added the white dot on the intersection, it goes slightly out a little bit. That doesn't matter too much because that can represent the dazzle of light hitting something. I mean, it's not a major issue, and if you didn't like it, just go back with a bit of black paint and wipe it out. But quite often I'll leave those little white dots when they go over on edges. Right, so now I'm painting the fur collar. It's a sort of a dry brush technique, again very similar to how I did the bone on the skull, using just the side of the brush. If you notice, I'm painting the fur in the direction of the sculpted detail. If you start painting backwards and forwards too much in multiple directions, it will look more messy. You'll get paint within the recesses, which will destroy the detail slightly. You've got to be quite careful while you do this as well. Obviously, you've painted lots of areas. I do actually get a little bit of paint on the one of the circles on the armour, so later on I have to go back and fix that. You can see as I'm painting it that the brush is splitting on the tip again. Again, this is showing you that you're damaging the brush. If you look down near the base of the ferrule of the brush, you can see where it attaches to the wooden handle. That is covered in paint. This is my mixing brush again, because I don't mind wearing these out. You can see at this stage as well that the fur is way too bright for the model, but you can always tone things down, which is what I planned before I did this. I was actually looking at the box art of the model when I painted it, and it is so I've gone for the same kind of materials as the model, the artist seemed to have chosen, and this is also why the model has the pink magenta kind of glow in his eyes at the end, because that's what the box art has, and I thought it looked really cool. Right, so here you can see that I've dry brushed all of the fur on the model. Now I've got two paints that I've turned into glazes. There's Abaddon Black and Death Guard Green. Be aware that the glazing on this takes quite a while. The issue is that because there's recesses in here and there's lots of them, even though the you're doing a very thin layer of paint and it should dry quite quickly, because it's because the paint is sucked into the recess, and that you should try and get it out a little bit if you can, if you see any big pools or anything, but it will take that little bit longer to dry, being these tiny little pools all over. Here you can see I'm fixing the cloak on the shoulder that I foolishly thought was a shoulder pad to begin with. I'm doing that partly because I'm having to wait for these glazes to dry. I'm putting the glaze around the circle on the chest because I want those to stand out a bit more, so I'm dulling that area down. But there will be lots and lots of coats of Death Guard Green. The black is, I'm only using very small amount of that just to get some variation in the transition, so it goes from dark to light with the lighter area around the top of the head. And the reason I'm using Death Guard Green is again, it makes it look like the fur is dirty and aged, but also it changes then the colour of the fur so that it doesn't match the colour of the skull, and then it separates them out a little bit, and makes the skull stand out more. The reason I'm glazing and I didn't just paint it all on as well, so this is, as I mentioned, I'm painting this for tabletop gaming, so I didn't want to spend a silly amount of time painting the model. If I was doing this for competition, I probably would have painted the strands of fur individually. If you saw when I did the video for painting Neve Blacktalon, I spent a bit longer on her and I painted each strand of fur, and then on each strand of fur I painted various lines as well to show different or kind of like additional texture. The fur on this one is sculpted a little bit finer, so I probably wouldn't have bothered doing that, but even so, there's a lot of strands of fur that you'd have to paint individually. But you can see here, as I'm as a step back, when I was talking about the glazes going into the recesses and pooling, so you have to be a bit careful with that happening, but you do want paint in the recesses. Because you dry brushed it over black, it's really high contrast in these recesses, which is quite jarring. So adding the glazes that go into the recesses, it's toning down the top colour, and it's toning it's kind of lightening the shadows as well. So here you can see where I've added quite a few glazes by now, and it's looking a lot grubbier and dirtier than it did before, while still being quite light. So now I'm painting in the eyes. I've started with a purple colour. I think it's Xerius purple. The eyes were a little bit tricky actually when I painted them, and when you see the photo at the end, I did go back and just neaten them up a little bit. I didn't want to spend too much time neatening the model because it's just not worth it. I'm not going to do anything with it apart from game, but you know, sometimes things bug you. You have to keep going back and changing them. I do start in this video painting the inside of the mouth, but I decided it's so recessed in there that you would, even if you paint it really bright pink, which I'm going to do with the eyes, because it's always in shadow, it doesn't look like it's glowing anymore. The shadow, you know, the natural light that you get from looking at the model, unless you're shining the light directly at the front of it, it just hides all the glow anyway, so it doesn't kind of work right. So for the main glow on the eyes, I'm using Vallejo model colour Magenta. I think they've run out of space to say fluorescent. I just call it fluoro pink. It's a horrible paint to work with. The colour is amazing. It's really bright and vibrant, and you can see there, just by sticking it straight in at the back of the eyeball, no, there's no eyeball, I mean the back of the eye socket, that it makes it look like it's glowing. So there's not actually a lot of work that you need to do here. I've mixed in some white to the side of it. You can see there, that was the smallest amount of white that I took from the white on the wet palette. It was just on the tip of my brush, and when I applied it, it completely turned, you know, took out a lot of the pink. So I end up putting a bit of white in the centre of each eye. But the magenta fluorescent colour is so thin that you'll need a lot of coats to get a nice strong colour with it. So I'd be cautious of using it too much if you want anywhere that's really bright to look glowing. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching.